Welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. Today, Australia's 29th Prime Minister meets the best-selling author of The Silk Roads to explore his extraordinary life in politics and beyond. Malcolm Turnbull had international careers in law, business, and the media before entering politics at the age of 50. As Prime Minister, he reformed Australia's personal income tax, education and childcare systems, and oversaw the legislation of same-sex marriage. Peter Frankopan is Professor of Global History at Oxford University, where he is also a Senior Research Fellow at Worcester College and Director of the Center for Byzantine Research. He is the best-selling author of The First Crusade, The Call from the East. In today's live stream, Malcolm will explore his successes and failures, giving candid insights into the colorful characters and controversies of top-tier politics and the contentious events of his life. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Peter and Malcolm.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And good morning from me here in Oxford, and good evening to you, Malcolm. Where are you? The curtains suggest that it's nighttime.
No, well, I'm in Sydney. It's that is a backdrop with a nice design with Australian flora on it. But it's now 6 p.m. in Sydney.
And what have you tell us a bit about what you've been up to in lockdown these last few months? Has this been a moment of respite and relief that you're not in the front line of politics? Are you missing the rough and tumble? How have the last few months been for you?
Well, look, you always miss. I mean, being Prime Minister of Australia is the best job in Australia, so inevitably you miss that. But those jobs never go on forever. But I have to say, I had an unusual experience because my book, which you have behind you, there, a bigger picture, that are available at good bookshops. They always say books are available at good bookshops, but what sort of books are available at bad bookshops?
There's no such thing as a bad bookshop.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. I think that's a superfluous adjective. Anyway, the book tour, the book was published on the 20th of April in Australia. And so we couldn't do a normal book tour. There it is. And it was literally all done virtually. And you know, the publisher was anxious about it. We were anxious about whether we should delay it, but it all worked pretty well. So, you know, I think I mean, it's just a massive global catastrophe, but it is remarkable how much it's remarkable how much of the economy has kept going, notwithstanding the social distancing and closure of businesses. And of course, in large part, it's because of the ability to Zoom and Skype and, you know, so forth. That's been transformative.
But these are, you know, it's much harder, I understand, being a Prime Minister than it looks from the outside. You know, the commentariat, which can be furious about how bad decisions get made. But are you disappointed? I mean, this is such an enormous global crisis, such an important crisis, not just for Australia, but for different parts of Australia, different sectors, the aggravation of inequalities and so on. Lots of things that you've been interested in for a long time. Are you sad not to be involved in making decisions? I mean,
I would rather still be Prime Minister, yes, but I think there are very few people who've been Prime Minister who wouldn't say that at any time. But having said that, look, I think our governments, and we're a federal system, of course, our governments by and large have done a pretty good job. I mean, I think there've been plenty of mistakes made, but compared to a lot of other countries, your own country in the UK, for example, has had a very, the government's performance has been, you know, unsatisfactory. The United States, it's been outright catastrophic. And so, you know, I think our leaders have made fewer mistakes than many others.
I guess, well, it's something that's very conspicuous by its absence in your book, Malcolm. There's, I don't think, a single reference to cricket, which I'm extremely disappointed by as a frustrated cricketer myself. But sometimes when the fast bowling is coming in, you know, some batsmen like to stay in the pavilion and wait for it to pass, because you can get more things done constructively rather than deal with a crisis. But tell me about the right.
Crises are enormously helpful. Crises are things to take advantage of.
Okay, tell me a bit about that. There's a great line in your book, which you do mention Brexit, and you said Brexit was ironically, you thought was great news for Australia because it allowed refocusing of the mind. Tell us a bit about Brexit. Tell us a bit about Brexit.
I mean, look, that's not quite right. I think Brexit. Look, Brexit is a terrible mistake in my judgment. I think I can understand the politics of why David Cameron felt he had to have a referendum, but to have a referendum that was calculated, intended, designed to invite people to give an uninformed consent is extraordinary. You know, nobody knew, not in Whitehall or anyone else, what it would cost, what it would involve, what the consequences would be. So, you know, it's a disaster. And I mean, the reality is the UK is leaving. At a time of rising protectionism, the UK is leaving the largest free trade zone in the world. It's a staggering thing to do. Anyway, from our point of view, we look, it's from Australia's point of view, it doesn't make a lot of difference, to be honest. But in an ideal world, we would rather have Britain in the EU because we've got a great relationship with Britain, and Britain's always, you know, it's like having it's good to have someone around the European table with whom you have an extra special relationship. Now, having said that, you know, our relations with other European countries have improved or evolved, matured enormously in recent years. But in terms of opportunities of free trade deal, I mean, this is the naivety about Peter, about free trade. You know, people say, oh, we'll do a free trade deal. Well, the minute the Brexit referendum was passed, I said, we'll do a free trade deal with the UK. And we would. It would be absolutely free from our point of view. But British farmers aren't going to like that. So you see, the problem with the free trade deal immediately is Britain's agriculture sector, who used to been having all the protections of the common agricultural policy and so forth. So, you know, this is the difficulty. I mean, everyone plays hardball in trade deals generally, unless the two countries are so situated that comparative advantage says that, you know, they've really got nothing to lose from having, you know, in effect, open borders. Which would be our attitude to the UK, but obviously not British farmers' attitude.
Well, sticking on that, I mean, we're not going to, unfortunately, do it sequentially of how you got into politics, but if we're talking about free trade, talk us through the TPP and the struggles of trying to get a big part, and with how you saw that at the time and how you see it now.
Okay, well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was actually originally, if you go right back, it was an idea of New Zealand and Singapore's, but it was taken up by the Obama administration. And the idea was to have an Asia-Pacific free trade deal, but was a very high quality one. You know, one that had environmental standards, one that dealt with behind the border barriers to trade, not just tariffs, because, you know, that's only one tiny part of ensuring trade is free. You can have no tariffs and still have a lot of barriers, you know, and to trade. Anyway, so the TPP was, I think, at the time, and I think it's probably still the case, the highest quality, highest ambition free trade deal at a large regional scale around. And Obama and his administration saw it as being a vital part of American strategy, because what it was doing was imposing, by consent, obviously, on a number of the major economies in the Asia Pacific, Canada, US, Mexico, Chile, Peru, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Japan, and there are others as well, I admitted. But it was a big, so it was basically 12 countries, right? And it was a big deal. And it basically set the rules for the road in terms of free trade, open markets, but with high standards. And in fact, Ash Carter, who I think was Obama's last defense secretary, said the TPP was of more value to the United States in the Asia Pacific than another carrier task group. So that's how important they thought it was. Now, Trump campaigned on the basis that he wouldn't go ahead with it. And much to everyone's disappointment, these were in the early days, everyone thought Trump would govern differently to the way he'd campaigned. But in fact, he's governed, truthfully, more wildly than he campaigned. So when Trump pulled out, the deal was regarded as dead literally by everybody. But John Key, who was then PM of New Zealand, and I had the thought that we should try to keep with it. And John, not long after that, very soon after that, retired. But I stuck with it. I was persistent, and I persuaded Shinzo Abe that we should stick with it. And we did. And, we ended up, it's now called the CPTPP. It was a concession to Justin Trudeau, who wanted to have some sort of nice left-wing language around it. So it's comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, completely meaningless. But anyway, it's the TPP 11, as I preferred to call it, is up and running. And it's a phenomenal outcome because the UK could join it. And they certainly, I think it's open. They could get a deal with 11 countries in one hit. And just as importantly, the United States could rejoin it. Whereas if it had been allowed to fall by the wayside, it would just be a pile of, papers in a lawyer's office somewhere. So that was actually one of the more important Australian diplomatic achievements in the last, decade, frankly, was keeping the TPP alive, because it was absolutely against the odds.
But it looks very different without US participation, and that might change things.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obviously not as big a deal without the US, but interestingly, it's still a very valuable deal. And again, a lot of people at the time, a lot of other leaders were worried that if we did the deal, it would offend Donald Trump. And, I had two answers to that. One, so what? I mean, if he's out, he's out. It's none of his business anymore. But the other one was to say, the reality is, by keeping it alive, you're giving the Americans a free option. Because they can always come back in. They'd have to get the consent of the other countries, but I'm sure they'd be able to secure that. So it was a very, very important outcome.
I mean, you say in the book, I think on the TPP, two things particularly. One is that your view is it probably wasn't just Trump, that if Hillary Clinton had got in, the noises coming from people around her were that there'd be pushback as well. So it wasn't just, who knows what might have been. Well,
the Democrats, Peter, was saying that Hillary was matching a bit sotto voce Trump's rhetoric on TPP, but nobody believed her. And certainly, I think it would have been. I think the Americans would have stuck with the TPP if Hillary had won. They probably would have passed it in the lame duck session of Congress. That's what Obama was hoping, that it would get ratified, in that period between the election in November and when the new Congress and the new president, for that matter, take their seats in January. But with the change of administration, there was no chance of that.
But then the other thing that you make the point in the book is that the way that you found to deal with Trump, partly framed from having dealt in the business world and so on with people similar types, I guess, was that the only option you had was to stand up and push back rather than think you could manage the relationship. To tell us about, I know that Trump, you took a few bouncers from him. He called the call with you the worst call by far that he made with any leader. How did you find with Trump personally? But also, I mean, the question I really like to ask is how does Australia navigate between changing US ideas about Asia Pacific and Australia? But tell us about Trump on a personal level, how you manage that and rebuilt relationships and so on.
Well, I mean, Trump is Trump is actually, pretty straightforward. He's what you see is what you get. He is a big, brash, narcissistic, billionaire, bully personality. I mean, I've dealt with, Kerry Packer, who I worked very closely with for quite a while, was not dissimilar. Jimmy Goldsmith, Bob Maxwell. There's plenty of them, right? And it's a type. And Trump's running America in that style. And I'm not saying Donald Trump is a narcissistic bully. It's like saying the Pope's a Catholic. It's so obvious. Now, that's his style. And it's actually worked for him politically until recently, and it may still work for him in November. But if you are dealing with him, if you're his counterparty, the one thing you cannot do is be a sycophant. If you just suck up, then he will see that as a sign of weakness and want more sucking up. So there's no point being rude or scratchy, but you've got to absolutely stand your ground. And that's the advice for every leader. Whether you're the Prime Minister of the UK or President of France or whatever, you've got to stand your ground, state your position. You can, engage in as much harmless bonhomie and backslapping as you like. But when it comes to the substance, you have got to stick to your guns, because if you don't do that, A, you're letting your country down, and B, you'll lose the respect of your interlocutor, Mr. Trump, in this case.
And how's that? The personal relationships. You've got a great line in the book. You say that the international conferences, the G20 and so on, G8, it's all a bit like speed dating. Can business get done there? How important are those personal relationships, particularly with people who are complicated, narcissistic, or who don't give much away?
Well, Donald Trump is not the only narcissist in politics. I've been accused of being a narcissist on plenty of occasions, although I can think of plenty of people in my own country who would be higher up the scale than me. The reality is that at those conferences, the formal gatherings are often very scripted. Many leaders stick to their talking points. Very often, they will give a speech which pays no regard to any of the speeches that came before. Obviously, given my background as a lawyer and so forth, I probably come with a different approach. But I would always, whenever I spoke at an international conference, I'd have some points I wanted to make, but I would always make sure that I commented on and reacted to the things that were said before. Otherwise, it's pretty boring. But the most valuable encounters are the informal ones, where it's just two leaders, maybe an interpreter, maybe an official. But the more informal the encounter, the more valuable it is, because then you can get an understanding of the people you're dealing with. And you actually sometimes you can actually get an insight. Every now and then people do say what they really think.
And you say that you're talking to Xi Jinping and you're bonded over your common love of ancient and medieval history, which as music to historians is. You say you have a running joke, or it was a running joke about this. China and its change and direction, and the US policy toward China is obviously a huge issue for Australia, and has sharpened, I think, just under Trump, but over the last decade, a real shift, the Obama pivot and so on. How has been dealing with China from a security apparatus point of view, and from China and its position in the South China Sea, investments in Australia. How did you understand? How do you deal with that at the time?
Well, look, I'm a student of history, not a historian like you, but I was delighted when Xi Jinping took up Graham Allison's reference to Thucydides. As you know, Thucydides, at the beginning of his history of the war between Athens and Sparta, duly, narrates all the events that led to the war. That Epidamnus did this and Corinth did that and Kerkyra did that. And then he says, but look, yeah, okay, I've gone through all of that. But the real reason was the Spartans were nervous about the rising power of Athens. And that's what led to the war. And so Graham, made the point, Graham Allison made the point that where you get a rising power, anxiety about that rising power can in and of itself lead to war, lead to conflict. And, she picked that up at some point and said, well, we must avoid the Thucydides trap. And I thought that was interesting because so much of his foreign policy seemed to be calculated to actually trigger it. I gave a speech, I refer to it in the book, and back in as long ago as 2011 at the London School of Economics about China, and that was pre-Xi, and China was taking a different approach then. It was a much more pragmatic approach, whereas it has become, and I think this is largely in deference to public opinion within China, by the way, but it has become much more aggressive, much more belligerent with its neighbours. The rhetoric has become much more bellicose, and all of that is absolutely calculated to alienate the support that China should be seeking to win. In fact, I think at the moment, China is missing an enormous opportunity. See, Trump represents a massive opportunity for China because Trump is aggressive, he is erratic, no one knows really what he's going to tweet from one minute to the next. Consistency and, respect is not really part of his armory. He is discombobulating friend and foe alike, and frankly, friends more than foes. So in that context, the opportunity for China is to be very much the cuddly panda, not the scary dragon, to be very consistent, to be temperate, to be measured, and never, ever to overreact, right? Because that's how they would win support in the region, no question. But instead, they've sort of, it's as though as Donald has gone further down the inflammatory tweeting path, you're getting similar rhetoric from, Chinese official outlets, not so much from Xi, but, certainly from, all of the, from a government spokesman and the Global Times and the Renminbi and so forth. So it's I think that's a real mistake. It's a missed opportunity. And of course, if Trump gets defeated in November and you end up with a more conventional administration, which you would have if Biden was president, that opportunity, that window of opportunity might have closed.
Australia's been on the receiving end of a lot of that from China, from coal and barley through to the diplomatic different way of engaging, much more aggressive. And so is that policy mistakes? Is that a signal of things to come? I mean, you talk in the book about very persuasively about how important it is to engage with China and to be constantly trying to explain how this looks from an Australian point of view. You make the point that, in fact, China's aggression backfires. It not just doesn't help, it specifically pushes in the other direction. Is there a point at which that needs to be reviewed, and in fact the engagement doesn't really work as well, and the harming of Australian?
Peter, I think engagement works. Look, you're always better off talking to people than not talking to people. But you've got to recognize, it's important to recognize that the reactions from the Chinese Communist Party are very, very instrumental. Outrage is invariably confected. And so there's not a lot of, it's not as extempore, it's not, whereas I think Donald Trump's performances are definitely extempore and, winging it, but it's very different in Beijing. And so they've taken the course of action they have, I think largely out of deference to Chinese public opinion. And I think it has been quite counterproductive. Now, threatening, for example, my government decided that we would not, some years ago now, we would not have what we called high-risk vendors, which for all practical purposes meant Huawei and ZTE building our 5G network. And, there's a whole lot of technical reasons for that, which we could go into. Everyone will switch off though, unless they're telecom engineers, in which case they'll probably decide that it's not technical enough. But anyway, we made that decision. The subsequent events where we've had outright bullying from Chinese officials, threatening to trade consequences for Australia, what does that do? All of that does is confirm the wisdom of the decision we took. Because you can't, in the same breath, say, we would never take advantage of, having, all of your 5G communications controlled by or provided by a Chinese vendor. We would never take advantage of that extraordinary leverage that gave us, because we're lovely people and we're, very kind, and we'd never, ever do anything as awful as that. But then at the same time, if then in the same breath, you've got the Chinese ambassador to Australia out in the media saying, if there's any more impertinence from the Australian government, there'll be trade consequences. This is the problem. That they honestly, when Trump barreled onto the scene, they should have said, here is the opportunity. We are going to be as unlike him as we can be. And there was a massive opportunity for differentiation, and they missed it.
And in this world, because I know that you've had a background in tech and in well before you went into politics and so on. So you understand this world, but clearly the world is changing very quickly, and cyber capabilities, both from a national security point of view, but also all those challenges that we face. How well does a government like yours, or how well can a government like that in Australia today prepare for that and understand what challenges are going to be a few years down the line? One of the things you write in the book, you say that national security briefings were printed out on paper and handed over to you, and you had to persuade your officials to let you upload it onto an iPad.
Well, that's right. That's right. The briefing mechanism was a bit archaic, but look, I think the reality. Well, you're asking sort of how do you plan ahead? The key insight is this, Peter. A threat is the combination of capability and intent. Capability can take many years, decades to put in place, may never be able to be put in place. But intent can change in a heartbeat. Mm. And that's the key, that is the key insight. So you've got to hedge against changes of intent, if we thought everyone's intent was going to remain the same, we may not have an armed, defence force at all. We may just assume that everyone's going to stay remaining perfectly benign. But, we have to hedge for the circumstances where that changes. And so you've got to have that, you've got to hedge. And that means that in some areas, you've got to be able to say, some areas of where technology has, potential impacts on national security, you've got to say, well, no hard feelings, but we are going to, impose some restrictions on who's got access to that. And look, I think that's just the real world. And you can say to a leader, look, if you were going to be Prime Minister of your country for 100 years, I wouldn't have a concern, but you won't be. And so things can change. So we've got to hedge against those changes in circumstance.
And some of that's big ticket stuff, with defense side, ordering of submarines, that's a lot of money. And the question is, if you've got all this kit, what should it all be doing? So what is the idea behind the projection of Australian defense in the Pacific and within the neighbours? You obviously work very hard to have strong relationship with Indonesia.
Yeah, well, Australia's defence forces obviously got to defend Australia. That's the first obligation. We've got to be able to work with our allies. We've got to be able to play a constructive role working with our allies. And when I use allies in a technical legal sense, such as the United States and New Zealand, but also our friends, and like-mindeds. And that could include the UK. It can include our neighbours, Singapore, Indonesia, and so forth. So we've got you have to be able to pull your weight in terms of regional security. Otherwise, you can be legitimately described as a free rider, and that's not acceptable. And no one would seriously accuse Australia of that. We do have a very substantial investment in defence. We ramped up the investment in capabilities, hardware, if you like, during my time as PM, and committed to, very substantial naval shipbuilding plan in particular. And that has a whole lot of industry benefits as well, because if, my goal, and I believe the Morrison government retains this ambition, is to have a sovereign defence industry in Australia. It's a critical part of your, national endowment of industry and technological capacity. There's a tendency in the Anglo-Saxon countries to be sceptical about industry policy and refer to French dirigisme with a bit of scorn. But you can see, frankly, that there's actually been a shortage of it. I mean, the discussion about 5G in my book, I'd commend to the people on this call. But, if you just think about it, how did the United States get to the point where if an big American telco, let alone a British or Australian one, wants to move to 5G, they've basically got 2 Chinese vendors on one side and 2 Scandinavian vendors on the other? I mean, how did America lose leadership in the wireless equipment business? And the truth is, I think it was a bit like the way the British Empire was acquired. It was an absence of mind.
Is that, I don't want to hide the obvious and manifold and many benefits of democracies, but is there a challenge, you think, in democratic regimes of making long-term plans? Because you're constantly having to sell them, not only to the public and the voters, but often to the parties. And the last 10 years in Australian politics has been, even by normal standards, extremely rough and tumble. I mean, does that make it extra hard, the need to bring colleagues along with you when it's things like planning for defence or climate, for example?
Well, it is. Politics in Australia has had there've been a lot of political problems here, particularly on climate and energy. But look, I think democracy is. I think there is a question about democracy, frankly. Anne Applebaum's new book, Twilight of Democracy, the lure of authoritarianism, it's a very good book. You see, and again, I discussed this in my own book. If you look at it from the point of view of someone in China, they say, okay, we're not a democracy, but our leaders are technocrats. They've, come up through the system. They've run small enterprises, bigger enterprises, cities, provinces, and then they get to the top job. And look at all the progress we've made economically. And they point to the United States and they say, okay, well, you've had Barack Obama, who had not run anything in his life before he became president. He was a social worker, community organizer, and had been a member of an upper house in a state legislature.
I think he'd been editor of the Harvard Law Review.
Yeah, okay, he'd done that. And he'd been a senator for a few years, but he'd never run anything. But he was a good president nonetheless. But then you have Donald Trump, who is a property developer, reality TV show host with no experience in public affairs at all. And so, if you take the sort of pragmatic view, whatever is best administered is best, you can understand many people looking at American democracy and saying, really? Is that really the best system? Is that really the least bad system? And that's the challenge. So, I think in the West, all of us have a responsibility to lift our game, because you can see, and this is the point Anne Applebaum makes, particularly with respect to Eastern Europe, there is a lure of authoritarianism. I mean, in your book, The New Silk Road, I'm not suggesting you're extolling authoritarianism, but all of the extraordinary progress and riches that you describe in, Central Asia, to use in the new countries in Central Asia, there are no democracies among them. And the question is, what is the point where this is the problem, of course, you get into this sophistry about, the benign dictator is the best form of government. The problem is benign dictators rarely remain benign for very long. But I do think it's a big challenge. Tom Friedman wrote a good book about this some years back. I think, wasn't it called That Used to Be Us? Where he's basically comparing the decay of American infrastructure and institutions versus, the progress in China.
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or that that authoritarianism delivers results. That's a separate.
Oh no, well. Generally, I mean, this is the interesting thing. This is the interesting thing. I mean, China, the People's Republic of China, may well be the first case of a country that has been able to combine authoritarian government, but increasingly authoritarian government. And that's a very significant point. Increasingly authoritarian government with rapid economic progress and technological innovation. Now, all of those, each of those propositions I just made are contentious. But, we did all think 20 years ago that China would, as it liberalized economically, would liberalize politically. I mean, I remember when I was doing business in China in the mid-90s, in a very different world to what it is, very different China to what it is now, I thought China would evolve into a federal system. I couldn't have been more wrong. It's more centralized than it's ever been.
I think one of the problems for strategic thinking is that we, in the Anglo-Saxon world in particular, but more generally in the West, expect that everyone wants to become like us. And one of the things that China is selling, whether it's through its aggressive foreign policy or the wolf warrior diplomacy, is showing other states that there's a way of standing up and offering an alternative where states exist to be able to deliver results for everybody. And we've gone too far the other way with lack of bank regulation, with the problems of how the fruits are divided, that some of that hasn't done things right. So in fact, today, if you're born in, go on.
Yeah, well, here's a question for you. So we have in the West, and have had for, say, a decade at least, in most countries, rising levels of income inequality. Less so in Australia because of our very, high minimum wage and highly means-tested benefit system. But you've had rising levels of inequality, a lot of disruption of traditional working class businesses because of globalization, particularly in manufacturing in the West. And yet the political parties and leaders that have benefited from this have not been the parties or the leaders of the redistributionist left, but the authoritarian right. And so,
why is that?
Well, I mean, I think this is the lure of authoritarianism. This is the lure of the person who says, I'm going to sweep it all away. I'm going to drain the swamp. I'm going to, just promises the world. And people, regrettably, will often believe it. Now, it's easier for that person to get their message across now than it's ever been because of the decline of what you could call the curated media. I mean, if you go back as recently as 20 years, you could probably say 10 years too, but so certainly 20 years. If you wanted to get a message across to a large section of the community, you had to get somebody, an editor, a producer, a director, to let you get on their platform, their newspaper, their radio channel or whatever. Now you can go direct, and the cost of delivering and producing news is so, when communicating generally, is so much lower than it used to be, that people can literally live in their own siloed echo chambers.
Does that require regulation? Does that require state intervention? How do you balance free speech and the fact that these silos are very dangerous?
Well, therein lies, that's the thing we're grappling with, right? Because you see, if you go back, you take, in Sydney, the big broadsheet, so except it's not a broadsheet anymore, but anyway, the traditional sort of big broadsheet newspaper here is the Sydney Morning Herald. And when it was launched in 1840, it said on its front page, it had some lines of Alexander Pope. And they read, "In moderation placing all my glory, while Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory." And the old Fairfaxes were not especially politically broad-minded, but they did want to reach the maximum audience. Obviously, the more readers, the more they can charge for the advertisements. Now you can, and that proposition prevailed for a very, very long, until relatively recently. Now you can have a very viable media business which narrowcasts. So the political press, which in the English-speaking world didn't exist very much outside of London for very specific reasons. Now you look at news, Murdoch's publications and broadcasting platforms. I mean, News Corporation is effectively a political organisation that employs a lot of journalists. They're the leading climate change deniers in the English-speaking world, and it is a political. So you've got what used to be mainstream news organisations have become highly politicised, and at the same time, people are in a position to select their own news channel. I mean, if they want to subscribe to a Facebook page or a Twitter stream that contends that, Peter Frankopan is a member of the Illuminati and a worshipper at the throne of the Great Lizard, pardon? I've outed you. I've outed you now. It had to come out. But there will no doubt be a group that will confirm all of that.
And how does that, I mean, with climate change, I mean, there was obviously such an important part, both having been involved as a minister early on in your political career, but then as PM too. I mean, how do you read the runes for what needs to be done and the likelihood of getting there? I mean, first, John Howard didn't get Kyoto ratified. And then so all the pressures from within your own party of people who didn't want to either believe or take action on climate. I mean, does that feel like a missed opportunity
Well, it's a missed opportunity for Australia, but I mean the political opposition on the centre right of politics, so in my party, to effective action on climate change is considerable, and it's backed up. It's effectively a toxic alliance of three parts. It's the populist political right. It's the right-wing media, principally Murdoch's media, and of course it's the vested interests in the fossil fuel lobby. But we've got to a point where it is absurd, because when I was Howard's Environment Minister back in 2007, going green came with a cost. The renewables were more expensive than burning coal. That is no longer the case. If you were, we are literally now in a position that were it not for the political problems that we have, you would move rapidly to, and I think this is where we'll end up, but it's just going to be a rockier road and a more expensive road than it need be. But you would rapidly move to having a mix of renewable generation, wind and solar, mostly solar in Australia's case, backed up by storage, largely or mostly pumped hydro. I mean, look, I faced a lot of challenges in that area. I mean, arguably, I lost my job as leader of the Liberal Party twice over it, but I did get underway some very important measures, including the biggest pumped hydro scheme in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's Snowy Hydro 2.0, and that's going to be absolutely critical, because the key the key insight into renewables, by the way, is that whatever their capital cost, they are all zero marginal cost generators. I mean, your solar farm might both be 100 megawatt solar farms. Yours might have cost 3 times as much to build as mine, because for whatever reason. But we're each zero marginal cost generators. In other words, the marginal cost to us of generating an extra kilowatt hour is zero. Okay, so what that means is that you will find in the renewable world, you'll find times where there is an enormous amount of electricity, more than is needed, and times when there is the reverse. And so hence the technologies to balance that are very important. And pumped hydro is old-fashioned, but it's very effective. Batteries are another, obviously, and the other big opportunity is green hydrogen. If you essentially electrolyze water to break the hydrogen away from the oxygen, and then you can use that hydrogen, burn it as a gas, or use it in other forms to generate electricity when your sun isn't shining and your wind isn't blowing.
Would that make? I mean, that sounds both pragmatic and relatively optimistic that markets technology.
But it's not just optimistic, Peter. It's actually realistic. I mean, if you honestly, if you said climate change is irrelevant, global warming is irrelevant, and we ignore all of that, and you said, I need to have, I need to build 1,000 megawatts of dispatchable energy, so 1,000 megawatt power plant. In Australia, you would not build a coal-fired power station. You would not. You wouldn't build a gas-fired power station. You would do a combination of renewables and storage. And everybody agrees with that. The industry agrees with that. The only people that don't is this sort of, right-wing populist element that has turned what should be a question of physics into a question of religion, and it's crackers.
I mean, I think the problem is that rich countries have the capacity to invest and to deliver returns, particularly in the current climate, it's the environmental stress is in countries that are low and medium income, where that is where coal-fired plants are being built, and whether
but they're being built. They're generally being built actually unwisely. I mean, even in a, truthfully, and this is one of the, areas where the Belt and Road Initiative is quite counterproductive, where you've got Chinese loan finance going out to fund developing countries to build coal-fired power stations, which are provided by Chinese, vendors. I mean, the reality is that pretty much anywhere in the world, a combination of renewables and storage is the answer. We should, the mantra I used to have in government was to say that we've got, instead of having our energy debate dominated by ideology and idiocy, we've got to handle it with engineering and economics.
Listen, we've got a few minutes, so anybody who's got some questions, please post them. I'd like to ask you, Malcolm, at the end, what are your great regrets as a politician? Is there a chance you're going to come back again? What were the missed opportunities, and also what are you most proud of? Because we didn't talk about equalities and these kinds of things that are important.
Well, I mean, regrets about. I mean, I think the biggest regret is that we couldn't get the coherent energy and climate policy legislated. But in terms of achievements, we talked about the TPP. That was a big one. Some were mentioned at the outset. I think legalising same-sex marriage is a very important, that's quite a hard thing to do from the centre-right of politics, but it's an important social reform. Generally, I think in the, just under 3 years I was PM, I got a hell of a lot done, and much more than I'd expected. And in terms of a track record of achievement, it compares very favourably to my predecessors and my successor. But, so it's, actually getting things done in politics is a lot harder than people think. The press gallery invariably writes about who's up, who's down, who's winning this election, who's whatever. But, my view always has been, that's why I probably wasn't as good a politician as I could have been or should have been. I've always felt I've always felt power without purpose is pointless. And so, just being there, getting up the greasy pole, sitting in the big chair, if you're not actually doing something, what's the point of that? Now, but regrettably, for many people in politics, that is the point.
Well, I'm very impressed, amongst many things, Malcolm, but both how candid you've been today, but also in the book, you don't seem to bear grudges, and that's either because you've hidden it very carefully in the, but your colleagues, you've had a bumpy time through, repeatedly, and politics is a bruising business, but you seem to have got thick enough skin to be able to handle that, which is not easy to do, both with the media, but also your own colleagues.
Well, I'm not a hater. I'll tell you this, Peter. I've observed over the years, a lot of people in politics are driven by hatreds, by what they're against. I mean, Tony Abbott was my predecessor as Prime Minister, was a classic, an outstanding example of this, driven by what they're against. They're fighters, they're haters. And I am not a hater, and I never have been, to be honest. I mean, I'm a positive person, glass half full person, but I've actually, as I approach my 66th birthday, which seems very old, I have reflected over the years that the problem with hatred is that it actually hurts the hater. And I've seen so many people in politics that are actually wrecked by their hatreds and grudges, and and it is debilitating. So giving up hating you can justify it on a moral basis and feel virtuous, or you can justify it in the same way as you'd give up smoking. It's just bad for you.
That's a good life lesson. So I've got a few questions. First, my friend, the Kyrgyz ambassador to the United Kingdom, Edil Basalov, has asked me to point out that Central Asian states, with the exception of Turkmenistan, are functional democracies.
Very good.
But I think that's the problem about when we use the word Silk Roads. For me, that can mean anything from Cambodia through to Iran and so on. So apologies if that wasn't quite clear, but also making the point that unlike the Soviet Union, which was an economic basket case, China did manage to lift millions, in fact, tens, if not hundreds of millions, out of poverty. And so that model of economic development and technological breakthrough has...
Yes. No, well, I agree with that. And I just say, so apologies to the ambassador, but I'd also make this observation about China. The legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party's rule is, in my judgment, is founded on a social contract, the terms of which are, you let us run the country and we'll continue to deliver rising living standards. So a major economic downturn actually would threaten the viability, the legitimacy of the Communist Party in China. Now, whereas in a Western country, the depression, massive economic incompetence, or whatever, economic disaster, will not sink the ship of state, generally. You know, in America or Australia or the UK, the ship of state will sail on, the crew will feed the officers to the sharks and elect new officers. But this is possibly, you know, this is one of the key strengths of democracies, that the legitimacy of government doesn't come from its performance, but from the manner it was chosen. And of course, if it fails or is perceived to fail, it gets chucked out and replaced with another government.
I think that's very right. And I'm sure that that's something you know from the business side. The only thing you ever learn from are mistakes. And it's addressing those, correcting them and learning from those. And that's very, very hard in authoritarian states where it's buck passing or covering things up, which is a real challenge. I've got a question about Australian performer rights and whether those could or should have been better addressed. I don't know. That's quite a specific one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I would have to take that one on notice. It's I couldn't usefully answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay. A few people asking about who you think is going to win the US election, and then I think the last question after that to say something about migration. But how do you see the US elections panning out?
Well, I think look, I think it's obviously a referendum on Trump, and the polls would indicate that he's in trouble. But politics, election contests are like football matches. They're a relative contest. So you may be the worst football team, and you may be actually genuinely hopeless. But if the people you play on Saturday are more hopeless than you still win. And so the critical requirement of an opposition leader or a challenger like Biden is to be electable. And I think that, what Trump is going to do is to argue, he's going to try and argue that Biden is controlled by all these big lefties, which I think he'll struggle with that because Joe Biden does not look like he is a big lefty. But I think what he's going to do is argue that Biden is too old, that he's, not up to it, he's had it. Biden is going to have to be very sharp because, he's older. I mean, Trump's 74, Biden's 78. It does say something about the Democratic Party that they couldn't find somebody, who was 50 or 60 or 45 or something, but that's the risk, and friends of mine in Washington who dearly want Biden to win are concerned that Trump will trounce him in the debates and he'll look like you know, he'll look like he's just not up to the big job. So I think Biden will probably win, but I think that's, you know, that's that issue. I mean, you look at your recent election in the UK. I mean, if Keir Starmer had been the leader of the British Labour Party, as opposed to Corbyn, would Boris have won? I don't know. It would have been a lot closer, that's for sure.
I luckily, thank goodness, I'm on my side of the so my job isn't to comment on that one. But
Yeah.
I think that's right. The importance of having a strong opposition is the hallmark of a functioning democracy. And when things go wrong, then everybody loses.
Yeah.
And the last question, it's so important from an Australian perspective about migration, about immigration policy into Australia, about your local neighbourhood, Asia Pacific again, and how you see that. Is that as divisive?
Well, I mean, Australia's a migration nation, right? I mean, we are, in my judgment, the most successful multicultural society in the world. We have, you know, not very close to a third of Australians were born overseas, and over half of Australians have got at least one parent born overseas. So we are a much more of an immigration nation than the United States, you know, the great melting pot of the Western world, allegedly. And the reason we've been successful, I think, is because of mutual respect. The key, and this is why divisive language by leaders, whether they're Donald Trump or anyone else, are so dangerous. Because in a multicultural society, the thing that keeps the show together is mutual respect. And that, you know, and there's a lot of other elements too. But you've got to, you know, you've got to have a culture that basically recognizes diversity as an asset and respects it. And, you know, we have, I'm not suggesting there aren't, you know, I'm not suggesting, look, you know, there are anomalies and bad episodes in Australia, but by and large, we have in a very diverse community, we get on very harmoniously. But that's the key. So, you know, when people use racist language or, you know, prejudiced language or try to excite animosities between one group or another, you really have to jump on them. You've got to have zero tolerance for that, because it is the way multicultural societies fall apart. And so, you know, I mean, it sounds like a homily. I apologise for that. I used to give it sort of practically every day when I was Prime Minister. And I think Prime Ministers should, because you've got to provide that leadership.
Malcolm, listen, it's been a huge pleasure. But first, I'd like to thank everybody who's tuned in, whether you're here early in the UK or just about to have dinner in Australia or somewhere in between. Thank you to How To Academy for setting this up. It's been an absolute pleasure, Malcolm, reading your book. Here we go. Available in good and bad bookshops, if something.
That's right.
You've been very generous with your time this morning. Yeah. I've enjoyed reading this enormously, and I hope to get a chance to get you to sign it one day, either over here or over there. There's so many more things I'd like to ask about Rhodes and your Rhodes Scholarship, about how you got into politics, all these things we didn't even have a chance to touch on, and also what your connection is between Theresa May and her husband. I'll leave that for the readers to find out.
Okay.
I can play. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everybody, for listening in, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you very much.